She served her daughter an eviction notice, over dinner. Not with anger, with paperwork. "This house isn't yours, Julia," Marlene said. "It never was." Julia called it betrayal. But Marlene had the deed, the footage, and 30 years of silence to back her. And this time she wasn't asking to stay, she was asking them to leave. "Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe." The box was floral. That's what caught Marlene's eye first. Not the label in thick black Sharpie, "Mom, winter coats and sweaters," but the faded pink tulips curling along the cardboard corners. It was the same box she'd used to move Julia into her first dorm. Now it sat in the hallway, taped shut, slumped like something elderly and forgotten. Julia appeared behind her, breezing in like a realtor with a tight deadline. "Hey, I was hoping to show you something. Follow me?" Marlene followed. They walked past the nursery, down the hardwood corridor that still echoed slightly no matter how many rugs were layered over it, into the master bedroom. Julia gestured toward the far end, to a narrow hallway closet just beside the ensuite door, the kind designed for overflow towels or vacuum attachments. "This should be enough for you," Julia said, smiling as if delivering good news. "You know, at this stage in life." Marlene blinked, turning toward her daughter fully. "Enough. For what?" "For your things," Julia said, cheerful, dismissive, swift. "We're repurposing the walk-in. The twins need space for their school art supplies, and Dan's trying to declutter. Honestly, it'll help everyone." Marlene didn't speak. Her gaze slid past her daughter into the bedroom. The walk-in closet, her closet, was open. Empty hangers clinked gently against each other like wind chimes. Her shoes were gone, her wool coat, even the cedar blocks she'd tucked into the corners for scent. "I boxed everything neatly," Julia added, already moving on. "Don't worry, I labeled everything." Marlene stared at the new closet. There was one wooden hanger, one shelf, a faint scent of lavender sachet. She nodded slowly. "Of course." Later that afternoon, Marlene stood beside the dryer folding tiny pajamas with whales on them while Julia scrolled through Pinterest on her phone. The scent of warmed fabric softener filled the laundry room. Every now and then, Julia would hum or mumble something about toy bins. "You know," Julia said without looking up, "I really appreciate you helping out. It's just that the house wasn't built for 3 adults. Or 4, if you count Dan's mother always dropping in." Marlene folded a dish rag with precise edges. "And yet here we are." Julia laughed lightly. "You've always been so resourceful. I knew you'd adapt." Marlene's smile didn't reach her eyes. Her hands kept moving, but something had changed in her posture. More upright, less accommodating, like a string had been pulled taut along her spine. That night, after the twins had been tucked in and the lights had dimmed, Marlene quietly unzipped the hidden compartment in her suitcase. Beneath a layer of nursing journals and crossword puzzle books sat a thick envelope, property file, 1437 Lindale. She placed it on the bed, smoothed the flap open, and took out the paperwork. Pages yellowed slightly at the edges but meticulously filed: purchase agreement, utility bills, renovation receipts, all in her name. Her finger traced down the second page of the deed, where her full name appeared in bold print. Marlene J. Carter, the sole name listed under ownership. No cosigner, no transfer, no shared title. She flipped to the page her lawyer had highlighted 5 years ago and reread the line that had once been a mere technicality. Deed held by Marlene J. Carter in full. She underlined it with a ballpoint pen and capped the pen with finality. The sounds of Julia's laughter with Dan drifted through the wall. Something about shelf space, something about priorities. Marlene placed the file back into the suitcase, zipped it shut, and sat on the bed's edge, hands folded in her lap. They wanted space? She'd show them what space meant. She hadn't meant to end up here, not like this. Not stacked into the margins of her daughter's home like a forgotten anecdote. 3 years ago, Julia and Dan were drowning. He had just lost his job, and Julia was cobbling together freelance work while raising twins. They couldn't keep up with their rent, let alone dream of a mortgage. Marlene, freshly retired, offered them a lifeline. "I have the Lindale house," she said. "Move in, stay as long as you need." The property was fully paid off. A little sunlit bungalow with good bones and a quiet yard, bought with a teacher's pension and careful saving. Marlene had intended to renovate it into a rental for extra income, but when her daughter needed it, that plan was shelved without hesitation. Julia had cried on the phone, overwhelmed with relief. "You're saving us, Mom," she said. "We'll figure something out to pay it forward." Back then, it felt like a family pulling together. A temporary arrangement. Everyone understood that, or so Marlene thought. Then came the winter storm. A frozen pipe burst in Marlene's smaller duplex across town, flooding the downstairs and halting renovations. Julia invited her to move in, just for now, until the repairs could be done. Marlene moved into the guest suite, careful not to disrupt the household. She brought only what she needed, her books, her clothes, a few photo frames. 6 weeks tops, she'd said, then I'll be back on my feet. But weeks turned into months. Julia never mentioned transferring the deed, never offered rent. She began referring to Lindale as our home in casual conversation. When friends visited, she introduced Marlene as just staying with us for now. The shift was subtle at first. Julia took over decorating. New paint, new shelves. She rearranged the kitchen and boxed up Marlene's tea collection. Little by little, space disappeared. Her books were packed into bins. Her recliner was moved to the garage. When she asked about it, Julia responded, "We're just trying to keep the space streamlined for the kids." Then came the closet, emptied without warning, and replaced with bins labeled crafts and seasonal storage. That was the moment it changed. Marlene stared at the hallway closet, once filled with her carefully pressed suits, now home to finger paints and yarn. The same evening, Julia walked in, smiling too brightly. "This should be enough for you," she said, motioning to a flimsy hanging organizer inside the guest room. "At this stage in life, you don't need much." It was meant to sound generous. It didn't. That night, Marlene sat cross-legged on her twin bed. Yes, they'd swapped out her full-sized bed for a twin without asking, and opened her laptop. She typed carefully. Subject: Confirm ownership. 1437 Lindale High, Genevieve. Hope you're well. Could you confirm I'm still sole owner on record for the Lindale property? Just updating my personal records. Warmly, Marlene Carter. She pressed send and leaned back in the chair. No anger, no panic, just precision. The next day, as she folded laundry on the kitchen counter, she overheard Julia chatting on the phone. "Yeah, Mom's staying with us a bit longer. It's nice having her around, but it's definitely tight. We're trying to make the house more functional." More functional. Marlene folded a dish towel into a perfect rectangle. Later that evening, as Julia passed by her room with a load of mail, Marlene asked, "Have you heard anything from the contractor about the foundation at Lindale?" Julia blinked. "Oh, I kind of thought we'd put that on hold for now. We've really made this place home, haven't we?" Marlene smiled. "Some more than others." Her phone buzzed. An email from her lawyer. "Yes, you're still sole legal owner of 1437 Lindale. Would you like to discuss enforcement options?" Marlene hadn't responded to her lawyer's email yet. She didn't need to. Not immediately. Just knowing the truth sat secure in her inbox gave her a quiet sort of ballast. That, and the small manila folder she'd tucked back into her suitcase, under her folded nightgowns, where Julia never bothered to look. That Friday, Julia was in full prep mode. The house smelled like roasted lemon chicken and rosemary. Wine glasses clinked in the sink, and the dining table had been reset twice, once with linen napkins, once without. Marlene had been asked to just watch the twins while Julia finished getting ready, so she sat on the sofa, book in lap, while the boys played on the rug. From the hallway, she could hear Julia speaking to Dan in her sharp party host voice. "Let's make sure everything looks simple, clean, unfussy, like curated comfort." Dan chuckled. "Got it. Subtle affluence." At 6 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Women in sleek cardigans, men in brown leather loafers and wedding bands that gleamed with intention. Someone brought an artisanal pear tart, another brought wine with a label Marlene couldn't pronounce. She stayed out of the way, helping collect coats, placing them carefully on the upstairs bed, the one that used to be hers. Julia gathered everyone in the dining room, gesturing toward the spread with exaggerated modesty. "Just a little get-together. We've really grown into this house, and it finally feels like ours." That was when one of her friends, a woman with honey blonde hair and 2 white teeth, turned to Marlene with a soft smile. "Oh, so did you downsize recently? Or are you visiting?" Before Marlene could answer, Julia slid in. "She's staying with us for now," she said, placing a hand gently on Marlene's shoulder, as if to steer the conversation away. "She doesn't really use her own space much these days." Marlene blinked, but didn't flinch. Instead, she picked up her wine glass. "To growth," she said, lifting it with a small smile. "In all directions." No one knew what to make of that, so they laughed politely and changed the subject. After dinner, while Dan offered bourbon to the men and Julia passed around lavender mints, Marlene slipped away. The wine hadn't loosened her, it had clarified her. The corners of the evening sharpened, the edges of every word Julia had spoken slicing deeper the more they echoed in her head. She made her way to the garage. The overhead bulb flickered as she stepped inside, cool air brushing against her forearms. Dust settled in the corners like forgotten intentions. Marlene scanned the room, walking slowly past labeled bins, holiday decor, old toys, spare towels, until she reached the back wall. There it was. Her dresser. The oak one Leonard bought her for their 20th anniversary. 4 drawers, brass handles, once polished to a honeyed sheen. Now it sat beneath an old car seat and 3 paint-streaked tarps. She crouched down, gritting against the pinch in her hip, and ran her fingers along the surface. A film of dust clung to her hand. She wiped it off, slowly, deliberately, then opened the top drawer. Empty. Of course. But it didn't feel hollow. It felt like a turning point. A breath she'd been holding for 3 years finally let go. She stood, placed her hand flat on the dresser's top, and whispered, "I think it's time to reclaim my square footage." Behind her, laughter echoed faintly through the walls, a burst of it, then silence, then the faint clink of a wine bottle on glass. Marlene walked back inside, a quiet storm behind her eyes. "Tomorrow," she'd reply to her lawyer, with one word, "yes." The next morning, Marlene woke with a quiet resolve. Not a dramatic fire, just the steel-edged certainty that comes after too many small cuts. She didn't rush. She made tea, helped the twins with their cereal, and smiled when Julia reminded her about school pickups, like any other day. But after everyone left and the house fell into weekday silence, she climbed the stairs and walked into what used to be her bedroom. The scent hit her first. Lavender sachets mixed with something sharper. Detergent. Not hers. Then her eyes caught the change. The closet door was propped open, and inside, color-coded garment bags were packed shoulder to shoulder. Thick hangers, summer dresses in plastic, a labeled box on the top shelf read, "Fall Coats, J," another tucked in the corner, "Gift wrap plus costume bin." She stepped closer and pulled out a bin from the floor. It was labeled in Sharpie, "Mom's Stuff, Low Priority." Inside, a crocheted scarf she hadn't seen in 2 winters, a copy of Anne of Green Gables with her name written in faded ink on the inside cover, and a framed photo of her and Leonard from 1989, glass slightly cracked at the corner. She exhaled slowly, her breath barely audible over the hum of the upstairs vent. From the hallway, Dan appeared holding a sports drink and towel over his shoulder. "Oh, hey Marlene," he said casually. "Just grabbing my gym bag. Everything okay?" She held up the bin without expression. "Where were these moved from?" He gave a shrug, smiling. "Julia did a little reorg. You know how it is. Space is tight." Marlene blinked once. "Is that what I am now? Tight space?" Dan froze a beat too long, unsure if it was a joke. No, not at all. Just seasonal shuffle. I think the twins' craft closet was overflowing, so we had to relocate a few things." I see, Marlene said, setting the bin gently down. Well, if you're moving things, I'd like to know where my blue cashmere cardigan went, the one with the pearl buttons. I'm sure it's somewhere. He offered a weak smile. I'll ask Julia. She gave a polite nod and stepped past him, calm but unyielding. By noon, she was back upstairs, this time with a small notebook, measuring tape, and pencil in hand. She measured the width of the closet, noted the interior shelf lengths, then sketched a quick layout of how the room had changed. Even the dresser she once used had been pushed against the wall, repurposed for puzzles according to the chalkboard label on the top drawer. Her pencil paused mid-sketch. She looked up. It wasn't just space that had been taken. It was position. Every square foot that was once hers had been quietly requisitioned under the banner of temporary. That afternoon, seated at the breakfast table with her laptop open and her glasses perched low on her nose, she drafted a one-line email. Subject: Deed Confirmation Request. Body: Please confirm legal ownership of 1437 Lyndale. MJC. She hit send. It took 2 hours. At 4:36 p.m., her lawyer replied, Yes, Marlene. You are still the sole legal owner. No transfer, no lien, no lease. Would you like to enforce occupancy rights? She reread the words slowly. Then she scrolled up, looked at the original property filing from 3 years prior, and hovered her mouse over the phrase that mattered most. Sole title holder, Marlene June Carter. She picked up her pencil again, flipped to a new page and wrote one line in block letters, ENFORCE. Marlene stood at the corner of her folded sketch for a long time. Her pencil rested exactly where she'd written the word enforce. The lines she had drawn, closet dimensions, shelf measurements, even the depth of the bin, labeled low priority, looked less like an architectural diagram and more like a map, not of space, of boundaries, of what had been taken inch by inch under the illusion of gratitude. By morning, her hands were steady. She changed into a navy blouse with pearl buttons and sat at the dining table with a fresh cup of black tea. The sky outside was overcast, but the light in the room felt focused, contained. She opened her laptop and clicked on a blank document titled Occupancy Agreement, Lyndale Residence. Her fingers didn't hesitate. She entered the property address, her full name as legal owner, and then typed Julia A. Whitaker and Daniel Whitaker. Tenants. Month to month. 30 days notice required for termination by either party. Rent, $0. Terms, maintenance of shared spaces, respectful use of designated areas, no unauthorized storage of third-party belongings in owners' quarters. It wasn't spite, it was structure. By mid-afternoon, she'd printed 2 clean copies. She slid one into a soft white folder and used a calligraphy pen to write in graceful script across the front. Adjustment, not warning, not eviction, just a course correction, one long overdue. That evening, over stuffed shells and Caesar salad, the conversation was light. The twins babbled about paint splatter projects and field trip forms. Dan opened a bottle of Pinot Noir, poured generously, and Julia passed around seconds like nothing in the world was unsettled. But Marlene waited. She waited until the table was cleared and everyone had moved on to tea. That's when Julia leaned in, her tone casual but clearly timed. Mom, I meant to ask, do you think you could help cover a bit of the girls' tuition next quarter? They're waitlisted at the Montessori downtown, but if we submit deposit this week, they'll hold spots. Marlene smiled, warm, controlled. Of course, she said. But first, I'd like to offer something in writing. Julia's brows lifted, amused. Like a check? She joked. Marlene reached into her leather tote, pulled out the envelope, and set it gently on the table between them. Number A, formal agreement. Dan chuckled. You're being so official, Marlene. Julia opened it, still smiling, and then her smile broke. Her lips parted and her eyes flicked down the page as she read the header twice. Occupancy agreement. Effective immediately premises. 1437 Lyndale Avenue landlord, Marlene J. Carter tenants, Julia A. Whitaker, Daniel M. Whitaker. Her breath caught, then released in a short, sharp burst. You're This is a joke, right? No, Marlene said evenly. Not anymore. Julia stared at her. You're drawing up a lease? I'm establishing terms, Marlene corrected. Since I've already provided housing, it's time we define it accurately. Dan blinked. But we've been living here for years. Marlene nodded. Yes, without rent, without formal arrangement, and apparently without boundaries. Julia pushed the paper back like it was something unclean. Mom, this is insane. You live with us. We've treated you like a spare coat closet, Marlene said. Let's not revise history mid-sentence. Julia's face flushed. You can't just— I can, Marlene said softly. And I have. This is not about revenge. This is about reminding everyone who signed the deed. Dan cleared his throat. Is this legal? Very, Marlene said. You'll find the contact for my attorney at the bottom of the second page. The silence at the table thickened, brittle as old glass. Julia folded her arms, defiant. So what? If we don't sign, you kick us out? Marlene tilted her head. If you don't sign, you remain undocumented occupants, which makes you trespassers, but I'd prefer we avoid that path. I'm offering the kind route. Dan looked at the document again. His hand trembled slightly. Julia shook her head. You're being petty. No, Marlene said, standing slowly. I'm being precise. You taught me that, Julia. With your labels. With your closets. She paused, then leaned slightly forward, her voice steady as steel. You gave me one shelf, I gave you a lease. The document stayed on the table long after the plates were cleared. Julia hadn't touched her tea. Dan had stopped trying to smooth the mood. And Marlene, well, she'd gone to bed early, leaving behind nothing but quiet certainty and the lemon-bright scent of wood polish where the lease folder had rested. Even that smelled like finality now. By morning, the house had changed. Not in noise or movement, in pressure. The same walls, the same routines, but everything felt subtly watched, weighted, like gravity had picked a side. Julia stood at the kitchen island, holding the lease with stiff fingers, her lips pressed so tight they vanished. Dan stood at the sink behind her, rinsing mugs and drying them rhythmically, like he was afraid to stop. She actually thinks she can do this, Julia muttered. Dan didn't look up. She's trying to manipulate us with paperwork. She's asking for clarity, he said finally, and it is her house. Julia turned on him. Don't start. This is emotional blackmail. Dan sighed. No, Jules. This is called documentation. You're the one who's been calling her temporary for 3 years. Julia scoffed. It was a figure of speech. She wrote it down. Julia's silence said more than any retort. Then, with a sharp breath, she shoved the lease onto the counter and stormed into the living room. Well, I'm not signing it, she called over her shoulder. You can tell her that. She didn't need to. Marlene was already there, perched in her armchair, legs tucked under her, a paperback in her lap and her glasses perched low on her nose. She didn't look up immediately. I assumed you'd say that, Marlene said, turning a page with deliberate ease. Julia's eyes narrowed. You left it in the middle of dinner like some kind of punishment. No, Marlene replied, lifting her eyes now. Like a boundary. You're the one who always said boundaries were healthy, remember? You think you're proving something? You're just proving you've lost your mind. Actually, Marlene said evenly, I've found my footing. Again. On property I legally own. Julia gave a bitter laugh. You don't really want us out. Marlene didn't flinch. I want recognition, of space, of value, of the difference between being family and being furniture. Dan stepped cautiously closer. Maybe we all need to just talk this through. Marlene nodded once. Of course. My attorney's very calm. I'd suggest directing further concerns to her. Dan blinked. You retained a lawyer? She's been on retainer for years. That shut the room down. The quiet was too loud. Julia crossed her arms, voice lower now. So this is about revenge? No, Marlene said, rising slowly. It's about restoration. You boxed up my life, labeled it low priority, and pushed it to the edge of a home I helped make possible. I'm reclaiming what's mine. With grace, not grudges. Julia's face flushed. We have twins. We needed storage. You needed respect, Marlene answered. But you gave none. So now I'm asking for paperwork, a lease, or a plan to leave. She walked to the hallway, her spine upright, calm trailing behind her like perfume. Dan looked down at the contract. Julia stood frozen. For the first time, neither of them had anything clever to say. 2 mornings later, the envelope arrived. Hand-delivered, addressed in block print, to Julia A. Whitaker and Daniel M. Whitaker. From Hartman and Doyle, Attorneys at Law, R.E., Lease Compliance, Property 1437 Lindale. Inside, a letter formalizing a 14-day deadline to either sign the occupancy agreement or vacate. Tucked beneath the letter was a post-it in Marlene's familiar script, still open to signatures. After that, all next steps are legal. Julia read it, once, twice. Then she flung it onto the counter. It hit a fruit bowl, knocking 2 apples to the floor. Dan bent down, picked one up, and said softly, "She's serious." "She's serious," Julia muttered. "Actually serious." Dan said nothing. By noon, the phone calls began. To her sister, her cousin in Minneapolis, even an old friend from Pilates group. The story Julia told was simple. Her mother, once so steady, was changing, becoming erratic, paranoid. The implication was clear. Marlene might not be well. She left a lease agreement on the dinner table like a threat, Julia whispered into the phone, and now she's sending notices. Honestly, I think she needs help more than anything else. There were sympathetic nods, vague reassurances. But one thing Julia hadn't considered, Marlene had been raising and organizing before Julia had even learned cursive. Upstairs, at the same time Julia's story was circulating, Marlene was compiling hers. Not for pity, not for performance, for clarity. She opened the desktop folder titled Occupancy Records and clicked into subfolders marked Closet Displacement, Legal Correspondence, Lease Documents, Photos, time-stamped. Each item was labeled cleanly, dated accurately, and stored without emotion, like a file cabinet in a courthouse. She began composing the email. Subject line: For family reference. Lindale Property. Dear family, I understand some questions have surfaced about my role in the Lindale home and my recent efforts to define it. For those curious, confused, or concerned, I've attached documents that may clarify. This is not gossip. This is simply evidence. Warmly, Marlene J. Carter. Attachments Certified Property Deed. Marlene J. Carter, sole owner. Lease Agreement. Unsigned. Closet Images. Labeled Low Priority. Garage. Screenshot. Storage bins. Garage. Time-stamped. Email exchange with legal counsel. Photo. Adjustment. Envelope placed at dinner table. She didn't include a single opinion. No shading, no accusations, just context. And then she clicked send. By late afternoon, Julia's phone buzzed with replies she hadn't expected. From Cousin Leah. Jules, is this true? I had no idea Aunt Marlene still owned the house. From Uncle Paul. I think Marlene's being remarkably restrained. If this was me, I'd have changed the locks. Julia's fingers trembled. She paced the hallway, phone in one hand, jaw clenched. She sent documents, she hissed to Dan. She's trying to turn them against me. Dan looked tired. She's not turning anyone. She's just letting people see what she's been living with. She's weaponizing paperwork. She's contextualizing your version of events. That night, Marlene didn't attend dinner. She took her plate into the guest room and closed the door softly. Julia didn't knock. But the next morning, an email came directly to Marlene's inbox from her niece, Rachel. Subject line: I had no idea. Aunt Marlene, I'm so sorry. I just spoke to Mom and she forwarded me the file. I had no idea you were still the owner, or that they boxed your things like that. Honestly, I'm shocked. Thank you for showing us. If there's anything I can do, even if it's just to say this, I see you. With love, Rachel. Marlene didn't reply immediately. She sat in her chair, staring at the glow of the laptop screen, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. Not from hesitation, but from a strange new feeling. She wasn't isolated, she wasn't overreacting, she was documented, and now she was believed. The next morning, she passed Julia in the hallway. Julia's phone was in her hand, the screen lit with another unread email. Her eyes barely met Marlene's. "I hope you're happy," Julia muttered. Marlene smiled faintly. "Number but I am seen." Rachel's follow-up text appears on Marlene's phone. "Do you want me to come visit? You shouldn't have to face this alone." Marlene didn't reply to Rachel's text right away. She simply turned her phone face down and watched the shadows shift along the hallway carpet. The house had grown quieter since her email, measured silences, muffled phone calls behind closed doors, the delicate rearrangement of control. But still, Marlene didn't trust silence anymore. She waited until Julia took the twins to soccer practice and Dan disappeared into his home office. Then she opened her Amazon account and placed 2 orders, one for a slim motion-activated camera and one for a backup micro SD card. Both would arrive by noon the next day. She was tired of being cast as a ghost in her own house. So she decided to start keeping receipts. The cameras arrived tucked in tidy cardboard boxes, humming with the promise of clarity. Marlene unboxed them slowly, unfolding the layers like secrets. The first she placed discreetly inside her closet, tucked behind a basket of scarves on the top shelf. The second she installed above her bedroom doorway, angled downward, not to spy but to see, to witness. It wasn't paranoia, it was preservation. Once set up, she synced them to her private tablet. No cloud, no app alerts, just local memory. No need to broadcast, just observe. That evening, Julia noticed the small black eye in the hallway corner and paused. "What is that?" Marlene didn't flinch. "A motion sensor camera." Julia narrowed her eyes. "You're recording us now?" "I'm monitoring my private quarters. Since my belongings were boxed without notice, I decided to protect what's left." "You're spying," Julia snapped. "No," Marlene said, voice steady. "I'm documenting. There's a difference." Dan entered midway through, sensing friction but not ready to referee. "Is this really necessary?" "It is," Marlene replied. "If everyone's comfortable acting in this house, they should be comfortable being seen." Julia huffed. "Unbelievable. You don't trust us?" Marlene met her gaze. "You moved my wedding album into the garage." There was no reply. That night, nothing happened. The tablet remained quiet on her dresser. No blips, no motion. Just the faint buzz of nighttime stillness. But 2 days later, while Marlene sat on the porch sipping chamomile tea, her tablet buzzed softly. 2 movement flags, both mid-afternoon. She opened the video. There was Julia, in Marlene's room, without knocking. She moved to the closet first, opened a drawer, then turned, crossed the floor, and unzipped Marlene's suitcase on the bench by the foot of the bed. She rifled through it carelessly, pulling out folded clothes, a leather-bound journal, and a velvet pouch Marlene hadn't touched in years. Marlene watched the footage 3 times, not with anger, not even with shock, with confirmation. Julia didn't knock, didn't ask, didn't hesitate. And still, she had the nerve to call Marlene invasive. Marlene didn't confront her, not yet. She saved the footage, copied it to a thumb drive, and placed it into a small labeled folder marked Unauthorized Entry, 2:13 p.m. Later that evening, Julia passed her in the hall, eyes flicking away as if Marlene were just another wall to avoid, and maybe she was. Marlene said nothing. She just smiled softly, moved into her room, and clicked her bedroom door closed with care. The next morning, Marlene emails the video file to her attorney with a subject line that reads, "Preemptive documentation for records." The morning after the footage was sent, Marlene woke early, earlier than usual, before the sounds of twin cereal bowls clinking or Julia's slippered feet hurrying past her door. She ironed her blouse slowly, choosing one of the crisp navy ones with French cuffs. She clipped on a delicate gold brooch Leonard had given her on their 30th anniversary, a compass. She checked the folder 3 times, thumb drive included, copy of the lease, the time-stamped photos, and of course the footage. Then she brewed a fresh pot of coffee, rich, dark roast, 2 mugs out, 1 cream, 1 black, everything in place. At precisely 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. Marlene didn't rush. She moved with the kind of calm that made storms nervous. She opened the front door to reveal a woman in her 60s with a structured blazer, leather briefcase, and steel gray hair pulled back into a low twist. Elegant. Sharp. "Good morning, Marlene," said Mrs. Doyle, her longtime attorney. "Right on time," Marlene replied, stepping aside. "Coffee?" "Black. Thank you." As they moved into the living room, Julia's voice floated from upstairs. "Mom, did you get the mail? There's a package I need for the twins' school." Her voice trailed as she descended the stairs and saw the woman seated calmly on the couch. Marlene turned, coffee mug in hand. "Julia, this is Mrs. Doyle. She's my legal representative." Julia blinked. "Legal? Wait. Why is your lawyer here?" "To witness," Marlene said softly. "And to clarify." Dan appeared a beat later, catching the tension midair. "Everything okay?" Mrs. Doyle stood, reaching into her briefcase and removing a tri-folded document. "I'm here on behalf of Mrs. Carter," she said professionally. "This is a formal notice to comply or vacate. You are currently residing on property held solely in her name. Due to ongoing refusal to formalize occupancy through a lease, this action is being served under California Civil Code Section 1946. Julia went pale. "You're evicting us?" Mrs. Doyle remained steady. "You're being given the legal option to comply with a lease or vacate. This is not a forcible eviction. It's a formal request to honor boundaries." Julia's face flushed deep pink. She took the document, scanned the first few lines, and let out a sharp laugh. "This is insane." Marlene didn't speak. She simply sipped her coffee and sat down beside her attorney like the matter had been settled days ago. "You invited a lawyer into our home like this is a courtroom?" Julia snapped. Marlene gave her a calm, steady look. "You said I was unstable, that I was paranoid, that I was making things up, so I decided to bring someone who deals strictly in facts." Dan reached for the document, but Julia snatched it away and tore it down the middle with a single angry swipe. "There!" she hissed, throwing the pieces onto the floor. "Now what?" Marlene didn't flinch. She bent down, picked up the shredded paper carefully, and handed it back to Mrs. Doyle, who calmly opened her briefcase again. "Would you mind, Marlene?" "Not at all." Marlene reached in and pulled out a second document, identical, notarized, and sealed in a plastic sleeve. She stood and handed it to Julia herself. "You thought I'd only bring one," Marlene said softly. "You always assume I'll fold first." Julia's voice cracked. "Why are you doing this?" Marlene exhaled, but her tone remained even. "Because you boxed up my dignity and labeled it low priority. Because you opened my suitcase while I was out and called it normal. Because you've told others that I've lost touch, when really, I was regaining ground." "You want to ruin your family over a closet?" Julia whispered. Marlene didn't raise her voice. "I want my family to understand that proximity is not permission, and control is not care." Mrs. Doyle slipped the second notice into Julia's limp hands. "You have 21 days to sign the lease or vacate. We're happy to negotiate the lease terms in writing." Dan stepped in. "Can we talk about this privately, maybe without attorneys?" Marlene shook her head gently. "I tried that. I spoke. I asked. I emailed. You turned me into storage." She looked at Julia, her gaze clear. "This isn't revenge. It's return. Of voice. Of rights. Of ownership." No one replied. The room felt still. Not empty, but reset. As Mrs. Doyle closes her case and stands to leave, Marlene says, "Oh, and next time, I'll be inviting someone from the assessor's office." The torn edges of the first eviction notice still sat in the kitchen trash when the whispers began. By Monday morning, Marlene's phone buzzed with a half-dozen polite but prying messages. "Are you okay, hun?" Julia said there's been tension. "I heard you've been struggling, just checking in. Julia told us you might be going through something. I'm here if you need to talk." They didn't say it, but she could read the subtext as clearly as she once graded essays. "Julia's worried about you. You might not be well." Marlene sat on the edge of her neatly made bed, the morning sun casting long bars of light across the comforter. She held her phone loosely in her hand, rereading each message with a steady gaze. Then she opened her laptop. If they wanted a story, they'd get one. A true one. She clicked into a private folder titled Document Trail. She'd been updating it for weeks now. Photos of her boxed-up belongings labeled low priority, the closet dimensions she measured by hand, scans of the original deed, her lease proposal, the footage stills from the hallway camera. All time-stamped, all calmly captioned. Not a single word of slander. Just the truth. She compiled everything into a clean, accessible Google Drive and wrote a brief message at the top. For family and friends who may have heard partial accounts, here is the full timeline, including legal ownership records and communication copies. No commentary, just documentation. Marlene. She generated the link, set it to view only, and sent it quietly to her bridge group, her siblings, and the handful of friends who had reached out with concern. No angry emails, no defenses, just facts. Like wallpaper, unavoidable once noticed. 2 days passed. She didn't check responses. She didn't need to. On Wednesday afternoon, Agnes from Bridge called. "Marlene, dear." "I had no idea." "I know," Marlene said, her voice soft but composed. "You've handled this with more grace than I would have," Agnes continued. "I sent it to my cousin. He's a probate attorney. He said it's airtight. Impressive work." Marlene smiled faintly. "It's just documentation." By evening, she had 3 new connection requests on LinkedIn, all lawyers, all local, 2 women, 1 man, all with elder law or property dispute specialties in their bios. She didn't accept, yet, but she let the notifications sit in her inbox, glowing like tiny lighthouses. Downstairs, Julia was in full damage control. She posted vague Facebook updates. Hard to watch a loved one spiral. When seniors weaponize paperwork, families suffer. No good deed goes unpunished. Dan hadn't liked a single post. Marlene didn't respond. She simply removed her tags from every shared photo, archived her own account, and logged off. Her silence wasn't passive. It was surgical. Late that night, her phone chimed. A new text. From her niece, Rachel. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry, Aunt Mar. What they're doing isn't okay. Please let me know if you need support. I'm here." Marlene closed her eyes for a moment, then tapped a reply. "Thank you, love. Just knowing you see clearly is support enough." As she sets her phone down, a new email lands in her inbox. Subject line, Review Request, Elder Property Rights Podcast. The podcast email was still unread when Marlene stepped into the garage. She hadn't planned to come out here, just meant to fetch an old watering can she thought she'd seen behind the tool shelf, but the sharp scent of mildew met her halfway down the steps, and something inside her braced. The garage was dim, the single overhead bulb flickering, struggling against the gloom. It was colder than the house, the concrete floor still damp from last week's storm, and the bins, plastic, stacked 3 high, labeled in Julia's handwriting, lined the far wall like a quiet insult. She moved slowly toward the left stack. Seasonals, fall, baby memories, guest sheets, and then, one on the bottom row, untaped, warped at the corners. Mom's stuff, storage. The box was too familiar, not because of the handwriting, because she remembered the tape she used, silver duct tape, not the clear stuff Julia used on everything. She remembered sealing it herself years ago, after her husband's funeral, when she couldn't bear to hang his suit back in the closet. Now the tape was peeling. The cardboard sagged on one side, and the bottom edge was puckered, swollen with damp. She knelt, slowly, carefully, and peeled the lid back. And there it was. Ivory silk, yellowed in places, clinging to crumpled tissue like it was ashamed to be touched. Her wedding gown, the hem beaded with dust, the once delicate lace sleeves now stained with the telltale waterline of a leak. Mold freckles ghosted the edges like tiny fingerprints. Marlene didn't make a sound. Her hands, though older, still moved with quiet reverence as she lifted the gown out of the box. It fell like memory, soft and heavy. She held it to her chest, not out of sentimentality, but something more surgical. Mourning, measurement, finality. Behind her, a shuffle. Julia's voice floated from the kitchen doorway, casual and unaware. "Oh, I meant to move that back upstairs. I needed the space for the new bookshelf for the twins. It was just a dress." Marlene didn't turn. "Just a dress?" she repeated, barely above a whisper. Julia heard the tone. Her smile, if there was one, vanished from her voice. "I didn't think it mattered anymore." Still, Marlene didn't turn. "You know what matters?" she said quietly, standing. "Knowing when something sacred is yours, and knowing when someone else sees it as disposable." Julia crossed her arms, but the posture lacked its usual sharpness. "Mom, come on! You haven't looked at that thing in decades. It's not like you were ever going to wear it again." "No," Marlene said, walking toward her. "But I would have liked the choice to protect it. You took that too." Julia exhaled through her nose, defensive. "It's not like I threw it away. You just buried it in the damp and didn't check twice," Marlene replied, her voice calm as ever. She brushed past her daughter with the dress draped over her arms like a flag being folded after a quiet war. Upstairs, she laid the gown across her bed, smoothing the fabric like a surgeon preparing a patient. Her eyes stung, not with tears, but something closer to clarity. She stared at it for a long time, her hand resting on the bodice, fingers catching the place where the lace had begun to fray. Then she folded it. Not gently, not cruelly, but with precision. Like closing the final chapter of a book she once loved. The phone call that followed was brief. "Doyle Law Group," the receptionist answered. Marlene's voice was level. "This is Marlene Carter. Please let Mrs. Doyle know I'm ready. Proceed with full eviction." "Yes, ma'am. We'll file the notice today." "Thank you." She hung up and walked to the window, where the sun was now pushing through the clouds. The tree outside had started shedding leaves, the gold and rust falling in gentle spirals onto the lawn. Julia said was too much for one woman to maintain. Too much for one woman, but still hers. Marlene walks downstairs with the folded dress in her arms. Julia looks up from the couch, startled. Marlene says only, "You'll want to check your email in an hour," Marlene said, her voice clear and composed. Subject line reads, "Notice to vacate, 30 days." The color drained from Julia's face. She stood. "You didn't." "I did." The email had already been drafted the night before, the legal attachments included, and scheduled for delivery. A stamped, hard copy was already en route from her attorney's office, just in case Julia tried to claim it hadn't arrived. Marlene believed in leaving no corner uncluttered, especially when people insisted on pretending they didn't know where things belonged. By 10:47 a.m., it hit. Julia slammed into the hallway like a sudden gust of wind, waving her phone. "What the hell is this, Mom?" Dan stood behind her, silent, unreadable. Marlene didn't flinch. "It's a legal notification." "You're evicting us?" "I'm requiring clarity." Julia's voice cracked as she laughed. "Oh, come on! You're really kicking your daughter and grandkids out over a closet and a few boxes?" "No," Marlene said, stepping forward. "I'm reclaiming the house I paid for, maintained, and legally still own. You ignored the lease option, so now we move on to the next option." Julia was already dialing. "Fine, I'll call Aunt Rose. She'll talk some sense into you." And she did. And Aunt Rose called. Then Uncle Larry. Then Cousin Pam from Phoenix, who hadn't visited in 6 years but suddenly had lots to say about family loyalty. Each time, Marlene listened calmly. "This isn't emotional, it's structural," she told Rose. "It sounds like a breakdown," Rose sighed. "It's the opposite," Marlene said. "It's cleanup." She'd spent decades smoothing conflict, swallowing her pride, being grateful for the roof. Now she realized she'd built the roof and let people redecorate around her until she was boxed out entirely. A week passed. The air inside the house shifted again. Tighter. Tense. Julia stopped pretending. She slammed doors, whispered insults in passing, began muttering to Dan in hushed tones. The twins grew quieter too, like they could sense the floor beneath them ticking down. Marlene didn't raise her voice once. She baked banana bread. She watered the plants. She called the HVAC repairman because she refused to let the property fall into neglect, even during conflict. Day 9, Julia made one last plea. "You don't have to do this," she said over breakfast, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. "You could take the lease off the table. We could reset. Start fresh." Marlene sipped her coffee. "I offered a lease. You ignored it. You called me irrational, manipulative, mentally unwell." Julia crossed her arms. "I was frustrated. You were cruel." Julia blinked. The word landed differently than she expected. Marlene stood. "You have a choice. Same one I gave you 2 weeks ago. Sign the lease or start packing." Julia's voice wobbled, then cracked into a shout. "You've lost your mind!" Marlene paused at the door, turned slowly. Her voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. I finally found it." She walked out of the room, footsteps echoing against tile like a clock winding down. Julia walks into her bedroom and sees 2 boxes already labeled, "Winter Storage, Julia," and below it, in Marlene's handwriting, "Return to sender." The box sat on Julia's bed like an accusation. Inside, winter scarves and off-season sweaters were folded neatly, labeled with a sticky note, "Return to sender, Julia." The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, graceful. Marlene's way of tidying the messes other people left behind. Julia stared at it for nearly 5 minutes before shoving the lid closed. Downstairs, Marlene was slicing apples into a ceramic dish, the smell of cinnamon already warming the kitchen. She moved unhurried, humming an old, dusty Springfield tune under her breath. The oven clicked. The clock ticked. The day rolled forward, one deliberate act at a time. The next morning, Marlene's inbox pinged. The subject line read, "Interview Opportunity, Local Voices Radio, 89.5 FM. She blinked, unsure it was meant for her. The message was short but warm. "Hi, Ms. Carter. We've followed a local legal filing involving elder housing rights and intergenerational ownership. Would you be open to speaking about your experience, on air or off? Many listeners have gone through similar silent struggles." Best, L. Doran, producer. For a long moment, Marlene just stared at the screen. She wasn't a public person, never had been. But something about the phrasing, "silent struggles," made her breathe a little deeper. By lunchtime, she'd responded. The interview was quiet, gentle, recorded in a small studio with soundproof foam walls and the soft gurgle of a humidifier in the corner. Marlene wore her pearls, not flashy ones, just the ones Leonard gave her on their 30th anniversary. The host, Lydia, had kind eyes and a calm voice. "We don't have to talk about anything you don't want to," Lydia said, adjusting the mic. "I'm ready," Marlene replied. "And I want to make sure this happens before someone else throws away their wedding dress." They talked for 27 minutes. No names, no bitterness, just facts, feelings, and boundaries drawn late, but firmly. When the episode aired the following week, it was nestled between a gardening segment and an interview with a local school board candidate. But it caught fire anyway. Retirement groups posted the link with captions like, "Finally, someone said it." A mother-daughter support forum debated it for 3 days. The local university's law clinic added the case to a study module on informal housing agreements. Julia didn't mention the interview, not at first, but Marlene noticed her tone changing around the house. Fewer huffs, more silence, and then more presence. Like she knew the world had tilted and couldn't quite find her footing again. Dan, on the other hand, seemed to quietly accept the shift. He nodded more often, offered to pick up groceries, asked if Marlene needed anything before heading out. It wasn't repentance, but it was recognition. Then came the email. Subject, National Podcast Feature. Inquiry for Marlene J. Carter. "Hello, Marlene. I'm the executive producer for The Line Reclaimed, a national podcast focused on late-life empowerment and boundary setting. Your local radio segment was sent to us by 3 different listeners. Would you consider joining us to tell your story? You'd be helping thousands of others navigating similar invisible battles. Respectfully, Maya Coe, executive producer, The Line Reclaimed." Marlene read it 3 times. Then she walked out to the porch with her coffee and sat on the swing, listening to the early rustle of fall leaves. The air smelled like wet bark and distant wood smoke. Somewhere inside, Julia was packing another box, one of many yet to leave. Marlene looked out at the trees and whispered to herself, not in defiance, but in confirmation. She said I didn't need my own closet. She looked down at her phone, read the email one last time, and smiled. And now I have a microphone. She taps reply and types, "Yes, I'm ready to speak." The microphone had barely cooled from the podcast recording when the house fell silent in a different way. No more stomping up the stairs, no blender whirring at 6 a.m., no TV hum echoing through the walls, just the soft creak of wood floors and the faint chime of wind brushing the porch bell. Julia and Dan left 2 days early. No announcement, no apology. Marlene knew only because she walked past the guest bathroom and saw the hand towel folded flat and untouched. In the front hall, 2 boxes remained, one labeled Misk, Attic, and another sealed with packing tape, no note attached. Their SUV was already gone from the driveway. The key was slid beneath the welcome mat. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she turned slowly and walked back down the hallway, the one that used to echo with twin giggles and spilled juice boxes. Now it held only light. When she reached the master bedroom, she paused. The door to her old closet was ajar, just enough to cast a soft triangle of shadow across the hardwood. She hadn't opened it in nearly a year. Not since Julia moved her blouses to the guest room, not since "at your stage in life" became a justification for shoving history aside. Marlene pressed her palm to the door. Cool, solid, still hers. She eased it open. The bulb flickered to life with a familiar buzz. Same brass pull chain, same slight hum of electricity in the walls. The top shelf still held the lavender sachets she'd tucked away before surgery. The lower rail was bare, emptied of Julia's trench coats and dry-clean-only wardrobe. It was hers again. One by one, she opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed and returned her scarves to the closet, folded, rolled, smoothed with care. Her blue silk one, the gold-threaded paisley from her anniversary trip, the wool plaid she wore the first winter Leonard taught the twins how to build a snow fort. The scent of aged wood and faint lavender filled the air. Clean, undisturbed. She moved slowly, reverently, fingers grazing fabric like old friends reunited. Then she reached for the last piece, her red cashmere wrap, the one Julia once called dated. Marlene placed it dead center on a padded hanger and turned off the light. The switch still worked. She stood in the doorway and exhaled. Ownership wasn't volume, it was stillness, quiet clarity that required no defense. Later that afternoon, she made tea, Earl Grey strong, and sat by the front window with her journal. She opened it to a fresh page, date written at the top in firm cursive. Today, the space was mine again. Not because I forced it, but because I waited, documented, and endured. The doorbell rang once. Expecting a neighbor or maybe a curious friend from Bridge, Marlene opened it to find no one, only a small cream envelope resting on the mat where the key had been hours earlier. She bent to retrieve it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, bubbly loops, slightly slanted. From Lily. She smiled before even opening it. "Hi, Grandma. Mom says you've been really busy with adult stuff, but I wanted to ask something. Can I come stay with you this summer? Just me. I want to learn to knit and help you with the garden. Love." Lily. Marlene pressed the letter to her chest. For a moment she didn't move. Then she walked back down the hallway, past the room that was hers again, into the kitchen, and opened the drawer with the stationery. She chose a card with wildflowers on the front and began to write, "Dear Lily, the closet is finally clear. The bed is made, the yarn basket is waiting. Yes, my girl, come home." She looks out the window and whispers, "This time I'll label it properly. Welcome." The letter sat on the kitchen counter, edges curled from being opened and reread, its handwriting still fresh with something sweeter than apology. Invitation. Lily's words were simple, but they rang through the house like music Marlene hadn't heard in a long time. She folded it with care and tucked it into her journal, between pages where she'd once written through heartbreak in invisible ink. Now she reached for something more permanent. That afternoon, she met with her estate attorney, a woman in her 40s who wore thick glasses and listened like every word mattered. The office was quiet, paneled in dark wood and warmed by a small lamp that reminded Marlene of the one she'd lost when Julia updated the guest room. "I want a clause," Marlene said. "Specific, unmistakable, about housing rights and residency protections." Her attorney looked up. "You want to make sure no one does what they did again. I want to make sure no one can pretend it was kindness while doing it." The clause took shape that day. Tightly worded, firm but written with the kind of empathy only someone who's lived it could provide. It stated that any cohabitation, family or otherwise, must be mutual, documented, and revocable at the owner's discretion. No assumed privileges, no silent erasures. Signed, Marlene J. Carter, owner. The word carried new weight, not just of land and title, but of self. Afterwards, she stopped by the small legal clinic she'd walked past dozens of times before, but never entered. The sign had always caught her eye. "Legal literacy for elders, know what's yours." She introduced herself, told them she had time and experience. By the next week, she was sitting with women who looked startled by her story, but comforted by her clarity. One client, Lorraine, held her coffee with both hands as if anchoring herself. "My daughter said I didn't need the dining room anymore." She turned it into a Pilates space. Marlene didn't flinch. "Did you buy the house?" "Paid cash after my husband died. Bin doku's yüz seksen iki." "Then let's start there." Every intake folder she helped fill, every clause she helped shape, became a quiet rebellion, a revision of the unspoken script so many women were handed. Be grateful, be quiet, be temporary in your own legacy. Back home, her days fell into a new rhythm. She and Lily painted the spare room together, soft sage and cream. They baked shortbread with lavender and orange peel. On weekends, Lily helped her catalog the heirlooms for the estate plan, tagging each piece with a note. This belonged to someone who mattered. One morning, Lily pulled open the closet and said, "You have a lot of scarves, Nana." Marlene smiled. "Each one has a story. Want to pick one?" Lily wrapped herself in a pale blue silk and said, "You should label these before anyone gets ideas again." The words landed with a spark. That night, Marlene opened her drawer of office supplies and pulled out the old label maker, the same one Julia had used to organize art bins and storage tubs. Marlene printed a single strip, glossy and unmistakable. "Property of Marlene J. Carter, not to be reassigned." She didn't slap it on a drawer. She tucked it into her estate folder. The next bridge night, Dolores brought peach pie. Nancy wore her lucky earrings. They noticed Marlene's table had new cards. "What's this?" Nancy asked, picking up a name card with gold trim. Marlene poured tea with practiced grace. "Assigned seats," she said. "Figured it was time I started labeling things correctly." Dolores laughed. "What happened to playing it by ear?" "I've done that," Marlene said softly. "Now I play by terms." The room nodded with the quiet solidarity only earned by women who've spent decades being told to make do. After the last guest left, Marlene walked to her room, folded the guest towels for Lily's visit, and took one final look at her closet. Every shelf neatly restored, every hanger hers. The light switch clicked as she turned it off. No fanfare. Just ownership, real and unspoken. She said I didn't need my own closet. I gave her the lease and kept the key.